Now, these COVID graphs that we've heard so much about this week, we've got to talk about if these graphs, if this research, if this data has been presented to the American, to the British people, to the British people, and if it's making the case for a second lockdown, it turns out to be false or misleading, or we don't trust it, then it helps no one and could cost a great deal. I mean, I think we can probably agree on that. So whether the correct use of data has taken place or not, I doubt very much. Former Prime Minister Theresa May criticised the modelling used by government during last weekend's Halloween press briefing. You'll remember it.
Let me take the 4,000 figure. It appears that the decision to go towards this lockdown was partly, mainly, to some extent, based on the prediction of 4,000 deaths a day. Yet if you look at the trajectory shown in that graph that went to 4,000 deaths a day, we would have reached 1,000 deaths a day by the end of October. Now, the average in the last week of October was 259 by my calculation. Each of those deaths is a sadness, and our thoughts are with the families. But it is not 1,000 deaths a day. So the prediction was wrong before it was even used. And this leads to a problem for the government, because for many people, it looks as if the figures are chosen to support the policy rather than the policy being based on the figures. We need to know the details behind these models. We need to be able to assess the validity of those models.
Well said, Theresa May. Duncan Robertson, Policy and Strategy Analytics academic from Loughborough University, focuses on COVID-19 modelling and analysis, is with me now. Dr. Duncan Robertson, good morning to you.
Morning.
Morning. Were these graphs correct or not? Was Theresa May correct or not when she suggests that the numbers were being used to fit the policy rather than the other way round?
Well, there were lots of graphs shown. I mean, there was a sort of long-term projection that was done at the beginning of October. There was a sort of medium-term projection. But I think the one that Theresa May was referring to was the one where, had those sort of bumps. And one of those was quite high. So the way this works is that SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, has beneath it a lot of different things. It has one that does behavioural modelling, one that does this sort of epidemic modelling. It's called the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Modelling. And beneath that, they have different groups. So they have groups, some of the best groups in the world, from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Public Health England and Cambridge, Imperial College, Warwick. So each of those does their own independent projection of what the epidemic is going to look like in the future. And the reason they do this is because basically the Cabinet Office has a reasonable worst case scenario which they're trying to look at and trying to basically look into the future, which is a very difficult thing to do. It's like forecasting a long-range weather forecast. It's quite difficult. But what each of these groups do is they model the epidemic using some assumptions. So, for example, R is going to stay the same. Maybe we'll have a little bit more increase in social connections because we're going into winter. And they produce their analyses. Yes. And they're all put on that graph, and one of them was high, but all of them, without exception, show that at the end of December, middle of December, we're going to go above the first peak, and that's essentially what you can take away from those.
Well, Sir Patrick Vallance, the chief scientific, if we don't do anything, the chief scientific advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, says it's a very grim picture. I think we all accept that. But the Office for Science corrected two of those slides on deaths and on hospital admissions, down by a third. Professor Carl Hennigan of Oxford University says those graphs were riddled with errors, and yet they were the key projections in making a case for locking down all economic activity virtually in this country and altering all our lives going into the future. So we're not messing about here. And also going forward, if the government lose public's trust, what are we all going to say when they say we've got a vaccine? This is too important to get wrong, and they've got things wrong, haven't they?
Well, you've got to ask yourself, who's promoting those sort of ideas? Who's promoting the idea that, this is wrong? Because, essentially...
Well, Professor Carl Hennigan of Oxford University and the Office for Science, the newly created Office for Science. It's a government body, isn't it?
Well, certainly Professor Hennigan isn't anything to do with the Government Office for Science.
No, but I've just mentioned Professor Hennigan and also the Office for Science.
Well, the Office for Science is Sir Patrick Vallance and is SAGE. And
so they've corrected
modelling.
2 of their own slides.
They did, and what's quite interesting is the actual central projection hasn't changed at all. So basically, if you look at what's likely to happen, that hasn't changed at all. All that happened is one of what's called these projection intervals, which is basically looking forward and saying what a range of values. One of them just came slightly in, so in a way, it's kind of a more accurate forecast. So, but the central projection hasn't changed.
But didn't they say that the amount of deaths is going to go above the first peak?
Yes.
And now it's not.
No, that's not true at all. And that's, I think, what's very awkward. And not. And this is the sort of stuff that we need to kind of clamp down on. And these sort of quite sensational ideas that are being promoted, not by your programme, but by some other people that you mentioned before. So essentially, the point is, why do we do this modelling? First of all, we do this long-term modelling to say, let's plan and let's, so we're not trying to get these worst-case scenarios. We're not trying to aim for them. We're trying to prevent them.
Right.
And that's the first thing to do. So, for example...
Sorry, I know we never have enough time, Dr. Duncan Roberts, I'm speaking with. What people would like to see is, as well as one side, as they see it, of the argument, which is COVID-19 is rotten, nobody wants to get it, and it's taking life. And our thoughts are with everybody that is affected like this. I've got close friends, etc. We know that. The other side is what we want to know. But what are the costs of lockdown? Why isn't that looked at in as much detail and presented in a balanced way with the medical hit that this country is taking?
That's a very good question. I mean, you assume that there are economic models that are produced as well by the Treasury to look at what's going to happen in the future. And yes, absolutely, those models should be published. So every model that was on that slide, you can go to a scientific paper and look it up. And if, people like Carl Hennigan don't agree with it, then they're perfectly welcome to publish their own models so the scientific community can validate that. But yes, you're right. So you've got the scientific models, the economic models, which aren't published. Basically, I think they're saying the same thing. We all want this virus to go away, and that will allow the economy to go back, to go on. So SPI-M produced all their minutes; they're all public. SAGE produced their minutes; they're all public. The economic models aren't public.
But there's a delay in that. There's a delay in that the publishing of that material, isn't there?
There is, yes.
How long is the delay?
To SAGE. Well, a few weeks, and that's down
stupid,
to basically.
Isn't it?
Well, and if you want to, question that, you have to question the Cabinet Office and the Civil Contingency Secretariat and say, where are those minutes?
Well, why wouldn't Whitehall want us to seal this? Why wouldn't they want us to seal this? I don't understand it. I mean, and also, may I just check with you, Dr. Robertson? The Statistics Authority in this country have rebuked the government, haven't they, for in effect, not presenting this data in a correct way. That's the official government Statistics Authority.
What they've said is, we want to see those assumptions for the models, absolutely, and they're now public. But all the models underlying that have been around for ages, absolutely. But the other thing is the data, of course, and one of the reasons that we have to rely on later signals, for example, hospitalizations and deaths, is the data for cases isn't as good as it was, because essentially test, trace and isolate has, got to a serious situation at the end of August where not everybody was able to get a test. And, essentially that's one of the reasons why the data isn't so good. And, the point is, why are we doing this? We're trying to get the virus under control and get test, trace and isolate working so we can all get back to our daily lives.
Indeed. Dr. Duncan Robertson, thank you very much indeed. Policy and Strategy Analytics Academic from Loughborough University.